fat.
What's up? ¿Cómo estás, mo amigos? Yo soy Ricardo Varendas, also known as Ricky Varendas, and today we have a great podcast for you. Ioan Grillo, he's a author, journalist, reporter since the early 2000s, I believe 2001. He's been reporting in Latin America on the drug problem, human trafficking, drug trafficking, guns, violence, murders, everything in between. Really interesting conversation, really interesting books. One is called El Narco, Inside Mexico's Criminal Insurgency, and the other one's called Gangster Warlords, Drug Dollars, Killing Fields, and the New Politics of Latin America. And we really go into some of the history of Latin America, some of the issues in Latin America, how to fix some of these issues. And we have a really fun discussion, because I think one thing we learned that when you get two people that have no dog in the race and are willing just to have an open discussion, you realize that there's a lot more questions than answers, and there's not necessarily a real understanding on how to solve some of these problems. So, but just some of his experiences, some of the stuff he's been through, it's absolutely mind-blowing. What a great guy, what a great discussion. You're really going to get some really crazy stories, and just some of the people he's met, some of the journeys he's been on. It's unbelievable. And if you guys heard him, he was on a Joe Rogan podcast, I think about a month ago or so. It was a really fun discussion. So if you want more of him, check out that podcast. I highly recommend it. I believe it was episode 1253. So check that out. And also remember, if you want to support the guests, buy the books. If you want to support the show, I have a Patreon page. And also, if you want to support the show, by purchasing the music you hear in the beginning, in the end, and the music that gets you from the intro to the interview. That's all Theory 6 music, which is Theory 6 is my solo music project, and you can get that anywhere. You can get digital downloads. And also feel free to hit me up on social media. If you're on Facebook, iTunes, if you're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, any of those spots, definitely check it out. And also subscribe to us on YouTube. Our channel is RV Theory 6, or you can just search the Ripple Effect Podcast and you'll find it. And anytime somebody calls in using video, like my guest today, then you'll be able to see us actually have the discussion if you want to do that. So if you want to put some faces to the voices, feel free to do that. And in the show description, I always put links to all my websites, all my social media stuff, and I also do the same for my guests. So it's an easy way to get more information on the guests, or to follow them on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or wherever it may be, if you want to do that, if the guest was interesting to you. So I think that's it for now. I have a bunch of guests lining up. I also have a show with Scott Horton that I'm having some issues. This isn't the first time it's happened, where I've clicked out of Pro Tools after the show, and then I go back into it a couple days later to do some editing, or to start, I guess, putting it together to release it and record the intro, and the audio's gone. So I'm gonna have to find out where that audio is. This is like the second or third time it's happened, and hopefully I can get a hold of it, and that show will be out soon after this one. And I also record our Skype conversations via some software. I forgot what the software program's called, but worst case scenario, I'll use that audio to put out the show, because it was a really fun discussion about geopolitics and what's going on in Venezuela and so much of the world today. So Scott Horton's always one of the most well-researched and really just knowledgeable people about current events and what's going on in foreign policy. So that was a fun discussion. I hope to get that out also soon. So enjoy the show, guys, and I will see you guys on the next one. Peace.
Hello, Ricardo.
¿Cómo estás?
Bien, gracias. How you doing?
Good. It's amazing how somebody who comes from the UK, your Spanish is so good. I mean, I was born 20 minutes away from Spain in Portugal, and I envy your Spanish because neither my Spanish or Portuguese is very good anymore.
Well, I've been here now 18 years in Mexico, and I've lived in Spain for a year. So, I mean, considering that, I guess that's a whole lifetime.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So, the only thing I've forgotten is a bit of my English in that time.
Oh, I'm sure. I remember when I used to travel to Portugal as a kid. I remember coming back, and when I was there, I would only speak Portuguese. I was constantly, obviously, around Portuguese people, family, whatever. And I'd come back, and I did find my Portuguese would be amazing. But when I came back, I actually did find myself thinking about what I'm saying for at least like a couple days, and kind of just reestablishing my English. So
yeah. Have you been to Brazil?
I have not. I have some family in there. In Brazil, I have some Portuguese. It's weird because Portuguese people. I mean, it's like a lot of immigrants and foreigners, Europeans. I mean, we're all over the place. Just I have some relatives, I believe, in Venezuela, in Caracas. There's a Portuguese community in Venezuela too, and then there's
I've been in Venezuela, and I remember meeting a Portuguese guy. They start a lot of the bakeries, I think, in
Really?
Venezuela. Yeah, a lot of the bakeries, and so in Venezuela, a lot of people eat sweet bread in the morning, and it's like Portuguese bakeries that really started that off. Yeah, a lot of Portuguese people there.
Yeah,
but Brazil's got some. When I went to research for my second book, stuff in Brazil, and I tried to learn Portuguese for that. And learned some, but then I was in the favelas and stuff in Brazil, so it was a whole different Portuguese. It was the Portuguese with all the crazy slang there as well.
Yeah, no, I've met Brazilians where I can't understand what they're saying, and I'm like, what? Like I'm like, it should be the same language. I don't know why I'm not picking, but it's just like you said, the slang. And Brazil's a big country. It's obviously surrounded by other Latin American countries, so they get a mixture of people moving there, and I'm sure it's some of their influences. Counting if you're from southern Brazil, northern Brazil, if you're near whatever other country you're near, their maybe dialect or their slang ends up mixing and matching. So. It's no different than the English, I guess, looking at the Americans and like, that's not a word, that's, you guys are making shit up, that's not the proper way of speaking, so it's, it is slightly different. And it's funny how, even though it's the same language as the Portuguese, I know many Portuguese people that struggle to understand some Brazilians, and some Brazilians I have no problem understanding, but again, it's slang. It's like meeting a Jamaican and.
Well, I was going to say about Jamaica. So when I went to Jamaica, to research as well about the gangs in Jamaica, and I set up with this guy there who said he had access to the shower posse, this famous gang in Jamaica, and to the family of this famous drug trafficker, Dudus Coke. His name's Dudus Coke. Fittingly, he's now in prison in the United States. And when I arrived there, I mean, it was pretty much straight off the boat. We drove down into this neighborhood called Tivoli Gardens, pretty hardcore neighborhood, and went to the house of family members of Dudus Coke and met his cousin and some of his aunties. And they first started talking, and I was like, damn, I can't understand it. I was like, I mean, it's obvious people have been there, but at first I thought, I kind of presumed I'd get by. I've known, lived in neighbours in London with a lot of Jamaican people and listened to a lot of reggae music. I kind of had this kind of dumb assumption I was going to understand everything. And first I was like, wow, I don't understand what people are talking about. And then, over the couple of weeks there, my ears started to open up more, and I started to get through to more of that patois. But yeah, that is a strong dialect or language. I don't know, people. It's a whole strong different way of speaking.
But there's something about speaking the same language with people that they just open up to you. They connect with you differently. If you go somewhere and I'm sure if you speak Spanish to them, they're just like, oh, this isn't just a regular gringo. This guy, he speaks Spanish. He's embraced our culture, and I think people love that. People, when you meet people from other countries, just being able to or willing to embrace your culture, I think people really appreciate that.
Well, yeah, when you're doing interviews with people, I mean, just beyond that, just the basic level of communication. I mean, I've done, you can get quite a long way with translators sometimes. And, I mean, like in Brazil, so when I was interviewing some of these guys in Brazil, and I had this guy I was working with, a great guy who'd spent a lot of years in the favelas, in the ghettos in Brazil, and built up these amazing contacts with some of the gangsters there. And I would speak Spanish because they'd understand a lot of this, it's similar enough. So if I'm speaking Spanish, they'd often understand what I'm saying more to break something down. But you can still get a rapport sometimes through body language, through, the way you can try and, but just knowing the language is obviously much better, and you're not going through a translator, which can kind of slow things down. So obviously it's a big help as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, a lot of Latin languages are very similar. My wife's Italian, and it's like a lot of the, grazie, it's similar to gracias in Spanish, or cucina, cucina, like it's all just like, so I could see how you could pick up parts of it. And I know I've met people from Spain, and their Spanish is much, I don't know if it's closer to Portuguese, but at least easier to understand if you're Portuguese than, Central or South American. But, they have that, their own issues with themselves, because I know I have El Salvadorian friends, I have Guatemalan friends, and they'll talk about the other countries like, oh, they speak bad Spanish, or they, their Spanish sucks, so even amongst themselves, you figure all the Latin American countries would have basically very similar Spanish. They don't. They are also very different. And have you picked up on that? I mean, obviously with all the travels you've done, have you noticed, or when you go to a country, do you have to change the way you speak a little bit?
Well, I mean, obviously I hear it. I think anybody who learns Spanish can hear the accents, different accents in Guatemala. Certain accents are very marked. I mean, the same in English. I mean, like if someone's like got a really American accent, you hear it. If you're a British person and you hear a very strong Scottish accent, for example, whereas for an American you might not differentiate as easily. You might confuse with like Irish. So it's the same thing with Spanish, I guess. Like if sometimes you hear like a really strong Argentinian accents are pretty easy to pick up on because they have that whole sh thing. So they say like, mi chamo, like Diego Maradona, when I don't know if you saw the interview with him during the World Cup when he was defending, during the World Cup before the 2014 World Cup when he was defending Tevez. Suarez, defending Suarez.
Yeah.
And he, ¿por qué lo mandan a aguantar? Or he's like, the funny ways.
It
so
almost sounded Italian, almost a little bit.
It does sound Italian because obviously as Italian people went to Argentina. So it's like how Italian people speak Spanish is a lot of what the Argentinian accent is. So you can pick up on things like that. And then sometimes there's accents like Venezuelan, Colombian, Panama. They're all quite similar. People from there. There was a big thing with the series Narcos, the TV series Narcos, with the ones about Pablo Escobar, who was played by a Brazilian.
I know.
On an accent, which most of the world don't care about. But for Colombians or Venezuelans about those close, they were like, oh, and it's like a bit like a German guy playing a British guy or something for them. But yeah, no, I don't change the way I speak. I mean, I think the Mexican Spanish is fairly is one of the most kind of universally understood anyway. So if you're not, you might not use like really specific words, or sometimes there might be like they have funny words in Mexico, like Tehuacan is mineral water after this town of Tehuacan in Puebla. So they just say, dame un Tehuacan. It's like, give me a Tehuacan, a mineral water. So I might change that, because if you're like in Venezuela and they don't know what Tehuacan is, and you have to say like whatever they say, agua gaseosa or something, like they change the words there. But generally it's like, yeah, just use the same.
So I guess for listeners who might not be familiar with your work, how does somebody from Europe end up basically going to Mexico and wanting to look into this, or even becoming a journalist? But like, what motivated you to want to be an investigative journalist and look into these stories, and at times putting yourself in dangerous positions?
So I had the dream of being a journalist for some years. It was just one of those things that I liked the idea of without knowing too much about it. And the kind of perception of kind of traveling around the world and going to places, and it seemed like a dream to me to do this. But at the same time, I messed around for a few years in England, did various things. Kind of a long story about my younger days there, and different jobs and different situations, and actually lived in different countries as well, in Europe, and spent a year in the Middle East. And finally, I already learned Spanish. I spent a year living in Spain, and I was looking at coming to Latin America to be a journalist. I like the idea of doing it in Latin America. And back in those days, because a lot of people now ask me, how do I get into journalism? They're interested. They hear me talk about these things, and they want to do it, which is great that people want to do. People want to be journalists and want to do this. Unfortunately, the path that I had is not really there anymore. There was this path for a long time of getting into foreign journalism, which was going to a country and working at an English language newspaper in that country, even if you had no experience at all. Like I had very, very little journalist experience. I wasn't qualified in journalism. I studied history and politics. But there was a path back then that you could go to a foreign country, you could work at an English language newspaper, and then once you did that for a couple of years and learned a bit of the trade, then you could start working for big media organizations, for newspapers, TV, or whatever. So I kind of had this, I learned from other people, this path existed, and didn't think about the idea of drug cartels and this kind of thing at the time. I was more interested in a romantic idea of the kind of left-wing guerrilla movements, the Che Guevara movements of the 20th century, and against the military dictatorships. That was more my perceptions of Latin America at the time. But I came to Mexico in the year 2000, which was a very interesting year in Mexico, a year of big change, the year that it ended 71 years of one-party rule, and you suddenly had a president coming in from a different party, who was a former Coca-Cola executive, Vicente Fox, and the idea of changing the country, opening up democracy, all of these things. So I came and got a job at the newspaper called The News in Mexico City. And, just got my job in there, started off in the cultural section, but I started right away doing stories about, gang projects and crime and drugs. And right away just kind of fell into this beat, and then carved out the crime beat in the newspaper. Just fell into it there. And then from there, that's when things really started.
And then, so at that time, was Mexico, did it keep getting worse? How bad was it when you started there? Did you see things improve at all and then get worse? Or what was the, how was Mexico when you first went there? Was it already as bad as it is today, or?
So it wasn't. So I already arrived in Mexico right on the cuff, right on the kind of on the beginning of this wave of cartel violence that would explode in the country. And it was an issue then, but it was a side issue. This is the same year that the movie Traffic came out, if people remember that movie from 2000. And that was kind of the attention to this, but it was kind of a side issue. It was still a crime story back in those days. It wasn't the huge dominating political upheaval, social upheaval that it would eventually lead to be. So then, when I first started doing it, there was other issues that were more in the foreground. There was the issue of this change over to more of an open democracy. There was the issue of whether political crimes of the past should be punished. There was the issue of the Zapatistas, one of the first things I saw in Mexico in the year 2000. I went to the central square called the Zocalo, and saw when Subcomandante Marcos led the Zapatistas to this central square and gave this speech. Remember in the year 2001 that was. And but so I started working on the crime beat, and I got a job as a super stringer, it was called, for the Houston Chronicle, basically writing full time, but on a freelance basis, on a without a medical insurance, just as a kind of freelance journalist. That's what the deal is with the Houston Chronicle. But it was a good deal. I mean, they still had some money at the time to fly me around the country and send me to these places. And around 2004, this violence started escalating in the city of Nuevo Laredo, on the border with Laredo, Texas. And they were like, find out about that story. And there began to be a bit of a newspaper battle between the Houston Chronicle, the Dallas Morning News, and the San Antonio Express, the Texas newspapers, to find out what was happening and why there was all these bodies turning up in this city on the border. It wasn't really a national or international story at that time. And, really I was seeing the beginning of a new kind of violence there. And the change was, if you go back to Mexico in the 1990s, a lot of the violence was, regular gang violence like you see in the United States. Guys with shaved heads and tattoos with pistols, shooting it out, that kind of thing. And what you started seeing was people in bulletproof jackets, metal helmets, with AK-47s, AR-15s converted to fully automatic, fragmentation grenades, using radios, and started fighting like paramilitaries, not fighting like regular gang members. And then started, and if they've got working with police, but then if they have to fight the police, they're gonna shoot it out with these guys, and then they're gonna murder and assassinate police chiefs, and then they're gonna grab 30 people and put them in a house and keep them kidnapped in that house. So suddenly, things were pretty crazy there. One of these funny things about when you're at these moments, in a way, of something, and this was going to change, and this was going to eventually affect all of Mexico. This would change the way that the drug cartel conflicts were fought in Mexico, and see the country really destabilize. But it's like you don't know at the moment you're really seeing historic change. You're just trying to figure out what's happening. And that was the beginning, and then it just began to escalate. And then when Felipe Calderon took power in 2006, December 2006, he launched a military crackdown on the cartels, and then it just flared up way more. And that's when you sort of got more and more escalation. And you started seeing the really crazy thing, the chief of the federal police assassinated in his own home in Mexico City. That was one of the wake ups. This has gone bad. The massacre of 72 migrants in a barn in Mexico. They had them in this place. And they just shot 72. A massacre of 72 people. Mass graves. Eventually, mass graves with more than 250 corpses. Single battles where you'd have 2,000 federal police fighting against 500 cartel hitmen. So these were when things started getting really, really crazy, and it was, just covering it through all these years.
That's wild. I mean, I remember seeing a movie years ago. It was actually with starring Jennifer Lopez, called Juarez, and it was about that town. And I think at the time, and I don't know if it was the beginning or the end of the movie, it showed some statistics about Juarez, Mexico, and that it was like, one out of whatever many women will go missing or get raped or something in their lifetime. It was one of the most dangerous places, and I remember seeing that. I'm like, wow, man, this is a border town. I mean, this is right there. And I mean, I've been saying this for a long time, and obviously you know much more about this topic than I do. But I'm curious on somebody who has as much history and can reflect on all this. Like my perspective has always been, all the money we invest in fixing or attempting or supposedly, right, fixing countries overseas and doing this and doing that. We have a country right next to us that borders us that has some major issues. And if really, it would be in America's interest to help them get on their feet, because it would fix two problems. One, it would fix Mexico's problem, obviously, with the crime and all that stuff and the cartels and the corruption, but it would also help with all these people who want to come to America, because a lot of these Mexicans, I mean, they're Guatemalans, Mexicans. I mean, these people love their country. They love their culture. Some of these people leave. They never see their families again. Who would want to live like that? It's because they come to America because it's a last resort, not because they just want to take advantage of our systems and all this stuff, or be criminals. And I mean, what's your opinions on that? Do you think we should? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with those two reasons why people should be aware of it in the United States. I mean, you do need to look at the world, and the world is interconnected, and these things affect. So, you have a country and your border falling apart, then it's true you have then refugees arriving. So you're connected to these things. But also I'll give a third reason why I think this is of big interest internationally. And that is that these are things happening around the world that, the United States is not immune from these things happening in the United States. Europe is not immune from these things happening in Europe. In some ways, this Mexican drug war, is the way I call it in my books, has been a bit of a laboratory for this new type of violence, which is a kind of weird mix of crime and war. And you see around the world, these situations where you have crime getting out of hand, where you have marginalized populations, where you have very, very big black markets and groups controlling these black markets. So these are things that people need to be aware about. How, like the United States, or how Americans or America should try and help Mexico deal with it. I think first United States needs to look at itself and its own policies on these issues. So with the idea of the Mexican drug war, and I think actually broader, looking out in a broader way at Latin America and the Caribbean. So you've got this part of the world, this America's part of, is in this hemisphere, in the Western hemisphere, in the Americas, which is the most violent part of the world. There's this study put out of the 50 most murderous cities in the world. It's not 100%, the stats. It's quite hard to find out these numbers, but it's reasonable. Not counting really the cities in war zones like in Syria. Of those 50 most murderous cities, 47 are in the Americas. And several of those are in the United States.
Wow.
So first, how come, now, if you look across the Americas, over, and especially Latin America and the Caribbean, in this century, so since the year 2000, you're talking about over 2 million homicides in this region in that time. This is bigger, this is worse than a lot of the wars in the Middle East. The bodies piling up. If you're adding up Mexico, Brazil, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Venezuela, Colombia, all of these places with these similar problems. So this is a big issue that people should be caring about. Now, what is the role of the United States? Now, the United States is really a policy towards a lot of these issues. It's no single policy. It's a mix of different policies coming from different places. So on one side, you've got the issue of drugs themselves, and obviously the United States being the biggest consumer of drugs in the world. And no one knows the exact number, but anyone can look this up online. If you type in what do Americans spend on illegal drugs, there's a survey which is commissioned by the Drug Czar's office, from the White House. That estimates about $100 billion a year on illegal drugs: crystal meth, marijuana, heroin, cocaine, illegal fentanyl now. So it's a huge amount of money. And if that money is pumping in to these organizations, you're not talking about a few $1,000s here. We're talking about billions of dollars over decades. And that money is going to the most violent people who can take over that trade. Because, when you look at this, the economics of a drug trade, so you look at cocaine, and a guide here for anybody looking at the economics of cocaine, seeing that. So you see, I was recently down in Colombia, and I went up into the mountains where they're growing the coca leaves for cocaine near a town called Corinto. So maybe you could still see very easily you just see the bushes of coca leaves there. So you see them. You see they're actually in that area. They're mostly indigenous people growing these coca leaves, and then they'll take these leaves and pick them and convert it into this first kind of paste they'll make, coca paste. Now the leaves they'll take and it'll be worth something like $80 for this big bag of leaves. They might convert it and they go through a certain first kind of lab called chakra, and then they convert it to a paste to get a bit more, a few $100. Goes to a second lab, which is a bit more of a bigger operation that some of the guerrillas or the paramilitaries or the Javier narcos have, where they crystallize it to create the kilo bricks of cocaine, which you'll see. It's a kilo brick, or they have it stamped with their particular brand name on the brick, and that's worth about $2,000 in Colombia. Been pretty stable price for a long time for one of those kilo bricks. Now that you get that to the U.S.-Mexico border, and that's worth about $30,000.
Wow.
You get that onto the streets of New York, and even if you cut up pure cocaine, that would be worth over $100,000. But people end up cutting up with putting in a bunch of other crap, other kind of powders and whatever they can put in and make it worth $300,000. So imagine the profits in that. Imagine a business, all the business that we're in, very difficult businesses. Imagine a business where you put in, you think, if you're a cartel guy, if you're one of these guys, think, okay, I'm going to invest, $2,000, but let's just call it, $2 million. But I'm going to make out of that $2 million, 30, 40, 50 million or more. Imagine being in that kind of business. Wow. So because that is just so much money to be made, doing something which doesn't take an incredible amount of skill. It's not a unique skill. Everyone can buy and sell this stuff. So who's going to own that business? The people who are the most violent and can say, this is my business, I'm going to run this, and if you step on my territory, I'm going to kill you and your entire family, and bribe the right people. And that's the creation of the war. So look at that issue of drugs. Right now, we're at a historical moment where we can have a debate about this issue. That's the first thing perhaps to look at. Now, I don't think there's easy solutions. Are you? Do you have any strong ideas or about the issue of drug reform or any ways you see that?
Well, yeah. My Portugal, just obviously, about the Portuguese experiment, and they've had huge success with it. And I think decriminalizing stuff and looking at it as a medical issue is probably a good idea. I don't think people, I have my opinions on addiction, I think is very different than probably a lot of other people. Just doing my research, and I've had Johan Hari on, who wrote Lost Connections, and I'm a big fan of Dr. Carl Hart at Harvard, I believe. And they talk a lot about how addiction, because if cocaine, and I've said this on the show a bunch of times, if cocaine had the same addictive personality, or if cocaine had the same addictive properties, then why can one person do it at a party because of some pure pressure, never touch it again, and somebody else does it at that same party and becomes an addict? And I don't think it's the cocaine. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Rat Park experiment, but are you familiar with it? With where they had these mice, they put them in a cage. They gave them cocaine in the water, and then it kept coming back to the cocaine eventually until it died. And then these scientists or psychologists just basically took in consideration that the cage was a part of the experiment. So they created this thing in these warehouses, I believe it was in Canada, where they called it Rat Park, and they gave it basically it's very similar to its natural habitat. They had places to run and play and eat, and other animals to play with, and the mice came, drank the water, and then never came back. And what they learned was that the cage was a part of the experiment. The reason why the mice kept coming back to the water wasn't because it was addictive. It was because it was unhappy, and that cocaine or whatever, I don't know if it was cocaine or heroin, that substance was bringing it some type of happiness. Now when you put it in Rat Park, it didn't need it. And I think that's kind of the moral or the story of everybody's life. I mean, we do things that bring us happiness. We listen to music that makes us happy. We hang out in communities, dance, drink alcohol because it makes everything funnier and better. It's like we're these pleasure monkeys constantly looking for some type of happiness. And I think when you lack that, when there's some type of emptiness in your life, if that substance gives you that happiness you're pursuing or looking for, then you keep going to it, where somebody else might, so that's kind of my opinion on it. I think that, we need to rethink addiction. I also think, obviously Portugal is a very small country compared to the U.S. So some people have made the argument that, well, yeah, that worked in Portugal, but will it work in the U.S.? It's a different culture. It's different, it's much bigger. But I don't think locking people up help, and I don't think creating a black market, because when has making something illegal ever made it disappear from the face of the earth? And I think that's another argument.
I think I agree with everything you said, but I think there's still some more questions there. I mean, like I think we can agree and we can get broad agreement that there needs to be a lot of rehab work and work with people for the reasons they have drug problems. I saw one number, which I quoted in a couple of stories, a number from a survey by the American Medical Association. Is that correct? Anyway,
yeah.
About 80% of people who need drug rehab are not getting it. Something crazy like 80%. So there's a huge room to improve there, and obviously to find money for this, but some of the money, like you say, in terms of just locking people up for possession and so forth, could be spent on rehab. So there's definitely room for improvement on that side of things. And for every, even though, some people you're going to give them rehab, you're going to offer them rehab, they're just going to go back and they're going to relapse. I mean, some people are chronic cases. Other people will respond and will find ways out. But because drug addicts or people who have problematic use, we say heroin, use a lot, for every one person you get off, that's a lot of money you're taking away from the cartel. Because if somebody is spending a couple of $100,000 a year on heroin, for example, then that money is going to people trafficking heroin, and that money goes to pay for hitmen and for supporting all of this violence in Mexico. So for everybody you get off heroin, you take that money away from them. But there's still a problem with decriminalization and rehab only takes us so far, because that takes us to where we're spending less time locking up drug users. We're not punishing them for the thing. We're trying to help them, but you're still keeping the sale of drugs illegal. So it's not drug legalization. You're still having the market is illegal. So still in Portugal, the cocaine that arrives in Portugal is still supplied by drug cartels. That is still money that is going back, into Colombia, to these groups, to armed groups, carrying out violence in Latin America. The heroin people take is still illegal, or most of the heroin is still they're buying on the street is still illegal and is still going to organized crime doing that. So then we get to how can we actually try and reduce the black market more? What can we actually legalize? And the problem is that when you reach, I think I agree with legalizing marijuana. I think that should be expanded. I think that's been a lot of good progress with that. But then, can you legalize cocaine? Can you actually allow, or heroin? Can you actually allow a store, a licensee to sell heroin or cocaine? And if you allowed if you allowed a licensee like a dispensary to sell heroin, then somebody dies from that, of an overdose. And then what's going to happen? Right as soon as somebody dies from an overdose, and somebody's like, "What have you done? And how come this was sold illegally to my son or my daughter? Bought this legally in the store."
But people die from alcohol poisoning. People die from drinking and driving. The thing with me, it's an interesting argument, because it always seems like I've had conversations with people many times. I've had Adam Scorgi on, who did the business, or the union, the business behind getting high, or something. I forget what the subtitle was. And he also did The Culture High, which was about the war on drugs. And he did those 2 documentaries. And I remember talking to people about those documentaries, and you get in these conversations with people, and it's do you legalize things? Are people really gonna do heroin and cocaine if they're legal? Like my thing is, like, I don't do cocaine because I just don't want to do cocaine. It's not because it's legal or illegal. Like, I could still probably get it, I'm sure. If I really had some addiction to it, I'm sure I could find somebody who could get it for me. So I don't know. I don't think, and then we're biased in regards to I lost my point that I initially wanted to make. We're biased towards, like, we're European background. Europeans very much have a history of drinking, so we look at drinking like it's nothing. Like I go to a Portuguese restaurant, in the town I live in Massachusetts, in Ludlow. I can be with my 2 kids and have a glass of wine. Nobody looks at me weird. Nobody looks at, like, you shouldn't be drinking. You're with you're with your kids. It's like, no, a glass of wine is completely fine. It's almost like it's not in the same category as the other drugs. So people who smoke weed will talk about how bad alcohol is. People who drink alcohol will talk about how dangerous weed is, and everybody just is like, I want to have the right to do the thing I like to do, but I don't have any problem with putting restrictions on everybody else's likes and wants and desires. So to me, it's always, I'm constantly, like, rethinking, like, okay, is my opinion on this because my drug of choice is alcohol, so I think it's not as bad? But when you really look at the statistics, it really is. I mean, when you look at, like, I know a lot of police officers, and they'll tell you, like, the majority of domestics, somebody's been drinking, car accidents, alcohol poisoning. So it's like, you could make the argument that alcohol has created, and don't get me wrong, I love alcohol. When I heard you, I've heard you talk about how you've connected with a lot of these guys, having drinks with them, and I think that it does. We can focus so much on the bad things about it that we forget that, like anything else, if you use it in moderation, it really helps with connecting with people. People open up. People are more likely to tell you a personal story when they're drinking. Not to, I'm not trying to provoke people to go out and just get hammered, but I think there is some positives to it. And I've had some of the best conversations with my friends drinking some whiskey and having a cigar. And if that whiskey wasn't there, we probably wouldn't have gotten that personal or talked or maybe opened up in a way that, with a little bit of a buzz than sober. So to me, I think it does some good. But, I think people should have the right to have it. It's the same thing with the gun debate, right? It's like, it's very similar. It's like, do you take people's rights away? Is making something illegal make it disappear? And it doesn't. You look at prohibition. I mean, obviously, mobsters just got rich, and then you can make the argument the government's a mob too. I mean, you look at so it's like, if you get rid of the black market, then you have these legit places where you can go buy I guess cocaine or heroin or whatever. You tax it, and then they'll do deals with the government, and there'll be only specific companies that can sell it or whatnot. So then you're just basically taking the money from corrupt cartel to the corrupt politicians or businessmen who have the lobbying power to I guess get certified to sell it or whatnot. So I mean, I had a freeway.
But I guess like, I'm open-minded to this. I'm not certain of the answer to this. When I go around and do talks, I always ask people. I say, who's in favor of legalizing marijuana? And almost everywhere I go, the majority raise their hands up. I went to Utah one time. I can't remember if I asked the question in Utah. I don't know if I asked the question there. But anyway, I most places I go to, like, the majority of people will raise their hand about legalizing marijuana. Some places more than others. And then I ask, who's in favor of legalizing cocaine? Who's in favor of legalizing heroin? And I'll get a couple. I'll get some. It was fun. I was on a panel alongside a guy from the DEA and a guy from the FBI, and I asked this question, and the guy from the DA kind of choked. Legalizing heroin is like, but like,
what's your opinion?
Yeah. So on this, I'm not sure on this. I mean, I mean, first we have to have the discussion. I mean, like we're having now, it's important to have this discussion. But like, if the thing about like anything with, you can have a political opinion about something, but you actually moving that to action. So what does that really mean? I mean, I talked to one of the people who helped get marijuana legalized in Seattle, in Washington State, and that, how that, I thought that was a really big landmark. That kind of really changed a lot of things, and it was really interesting hearing about the actual campaign of doing that and changing from a belief to an action. And in fact, she wasn't even really a big marijuana smoker, didn't have a history of being a big marijuana advocate. She was working for the ACLU and was on the idea of civil liberties, and she kind of started getting this thing rolling. So if we're really looking at saying, okay, we've got to try and take heroin, or take cocaine. I mean, what do you want to look at first? And find a legal place to sell it. How are you going to really, people start advocating. I don't really see people actually even advocating. I see people talking about having this kind of level of conversation, but not really out there trying to advocate to really make it happen. So in some ways, is there a belief in it? But is there really a movement to try and make it happen and really change the reality? Because we can sit and talk about it, but still the reality is the cocaine out there is illegal, the heroin out there is illegal, and that money's going to cartels. So I mean, one of the interesting things. So like I was in Baltimore, Maryland, and it was on one of the corners there where they're selling drugs, and it was interesting to me that it wasn't in, obviously I saw The Wire, was a lot of my education and my thoughts about Baltimore before was from The Wire. Getting there now, seeing it, it wasn't in the projects. It was on the main street, outside a store on the main street. I was there, 3 different crews selling drugs. 2 of them selling marijuana, actually. One of them selling heroin. And it was kind of amazing. And I tell this to people in Mexico, I was like, wow, you got here the military burning opium fields. And then in the American city, right near the nation's capital, you've got people openly selling the heroin on the street, and the police are not acting. So it's a kind of really funny disconnect there when you see this. But yeah, I mean, I'd love to see somewhere try legalizing. Who's going to be the guinea pigs? We'll give it to San Francisco, or give it to some city. So okay, you legalize everything for a couple of years, have shops, legalize cocaine, legalize heroin, legalize every drug, and let's look at what happens and how it plays out. But I think to make that a reality is a big uphill path to really to say, is this really going to happen? Is this really a path forward? Are you really going to see people? I'm saying, say if you give someone a license to sell heroin, and someone does die of a heroin overdose, then they're going to go to court on that. And I mean, I know you say alcohol, heroin is much easier to die of a heroin overdose than to die of alcohol poisoning. Now, you can die of alcohol poisoning. You've got to drink a lot of alcohol to die of alcohol poisoning. You can't die of marijuana poisoning in that way. Obviously, you can go schizophrenic and so forth. Or, that's a debate there. You can't, cigarettes, it's a longer path. But heroin, you can take heroin and boom, and that's it.
Yeah, it is an interesting debate because I guess the alternative is you make it illegal, but it's still on the street, but you don't, like you said, it's cut up. People are putting creatine or any other white powder in it. Sometimes dangerous white powders that, it's mixed in there that could be more dangerous than the heroin or cocaine itself. So it's like, it's hard because it's like, and then like you said, who's going to go forward and push for this? If there is a death, then who's responsible? There's no politician who wants that on their record. There's no activist or nonprofit organization that wants to get the backlash of like, hey, we thought this was going to be the outcome, but actually things got worse. Like, so I think talking about it, like you said, it's easy, but to put it in action, it's scary because it's like, well, what if we're wrong? What if it doesn't work out the way we think we're going to work out? Because if it doesn't, the results could be bad, and I think that's scary to a lot of people.
Yeah, well, and then talking about guns, you mentioned guns. So again, with the guns issue, the firearms issue, So then, you still have a debate about this. You could have a principle that, in the United States, the Second Amendment, the principle of the natural right to bear arms. Been having some good discussions with people about this. But still, then you get to the issue, do you believe that somebody who's been convicted, is a convicted felon, should have a right to have a gun? If you could say, well, they've gone in, they've done their time, they should have that right. Or you could say, well, so do you think somebody who's a convicted child molester should still have the right to have a gun? Do you think somebody who is already, gone and shot somebody in an attack and the person survived and they come out of prison, they should be able to go have a gun then? Do you think somebody who who is part of a violent gang which is doing shakedowns and is shown doing shakedowns and kidnapping should be allowed a gun? So there's still questions there, even if you say, okay, there's basic rights. And then obviously then there are questions of what level of arms should people be allowed to have? Should people be allowed fully automatic machine guns? I mean, in the United States, it's really interesting how actually you are allowed to have fully automatic machine guns, but you have to go through quite a long process. You have to, pay the tax and, get your fingerprints and photographs, and it's a long process, and then buy the pretty expensive fully automatic machine guns. But you're allowed fully automatic machine guns. Should you be allowed fragmentation grenades? Should be allowed grenade launchers? I mean, what? So still, even if you have a belief of these rights, there's still questions to be raised there.
Well, the gun topic is interesting because if we lived in a place where, basically all weapons that are military, like, automatic grenades, all this stuff, if all this stuff was illegal and we said we could have the same argument, like imagine if this stuff was never legal, if America didn't have that right, we would be having the same conversation as drugs, like, oh, if we make it legal, everybody's going to have all these guns and all this, people are going to be shooting each other and throwing grenades in each other's garages, and who knows what type of crazy shit was going to happen. And then we do live in a world where people can buy as much as they want. I mean, obviously, nobody stops somebody from taking a automatic gun or taking a grenade and harming somebody, but yet it doesn't happen as often as we think. So I wonder if the drug question is very similar, where from the outside looking in, it looks like, if we give everybody the right to have access to this stuff, all hell is going to break loose. But yet, the majority of the time, people are pretty civil, people are pretty level-headed, and they're not going to all of a sudden do something out of their character just because it's legal. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I totally. I guess I'm seeing things maybe a bit differently because, I mean, in Mexico, in Latin America, and this is what I've been living and following for recent years.
And they have strict gun laws, right?
Well, it's a bit more complicated. In Mexico, actually, in Mexico's constitution, you have a right. There's a right to bear arms. There's a right to have guns. There's only one store in the country which sells them legally. That's here in Mexico City, and it's run by the military. So you go there, and it's about 7 bits of ID you need, including showing you have a clean criminal record, having a letter from your boss. So it's a pretty strict thing there. And you go in there, and you can walk into the store, and they have actually a lot of guns there. Some people buy them from that store, and with permission and legally have their guns. A lot of people don't, and the biggest source is, or a huge source is the United States, and the amount of guns going from the United States into Mexico, which people are looking at estimates of more than 200,000 firearms a year going from the United States to Mexico. So there's still funny, things that are like surprising. And I'm learning about this, looking at the issue of gun trafficking. So I'm looking at a particular case right now of a firearms murder of an American agent. And when the guns were bought, there was a straw purchaser. The straw purchaser, someone who's paid to go and buy the guns for someone else. And he walked into a pawn shop in Texas, Beaumont, Texas, and bought 10 AK-47s. And these walked in, bought 10 AK-47s. One of these guns was then used in the attack, which murdered an American agent. So, there's more to that. There's also this whole report, inquiries into this, because the actually American agencies were watching some of these guys and didn't act, were letting this happen. But the fact you can walk in and just buy 10 AK-47s, I mean, you say, well, people right, they can have as many AK-47s as they want, but, surely for law enforcement, it's going to put some kind of alarm. If you just could walk in and buy, and it was like, he was a vet, and he was paid, I think, $650 to be a straw purchaser and buy 10 AK-47s. So $65 a gun. And, one of those guns is going to end up killing an American agent. So, even if you believe that anyone can, should have the right to go in there and buy a gun, still, should there be more? Now, there's some restrictions that even, now there's stuff that they want to have alarms. Like the ATF wants to be informed when there's big purchases. When someone goes in and does that, they want to know about it. And now there's certain states will be informed. If someone goes in and buys 10, above a certain level, they'll be informed about it. But other states not. Other states, they say, you're not allowed to be just given the notice about so when some of these things, like when still even believing totally in the right to bear arms and so forth, there's still questions there about, okay, what is the job of law enforcement in that, and how much should law enforcement try to stop those guns going to people who are going to commit murders?
Yeah, well, I think it's important, because I think very rarely do you see people not just pick a side and say, I'm either for everybody having as many guns as they want, or let's take away everybody's guns. And usually the truth does lie somewhere in the middle. Things aren't black and white. I think that you're probably right. You should probably have the right to own a gun, but there should be some restrictions on how many guns you have. You can't put a certain amount of cash in a bank without, red flags coming up and the government, getting a notification from the bank that something suspicious could be happening. So it's just, there should be some type of restrictions, I think, with all things. We talked about alcohol briefly, but, there's no real restrictions on alcohol either, So, but again, guns are slightly different. And I think that when somebody buys that many, even if it is for some type of hobby or collection or whatnot, maybe there should be restrictions on, maybe you could buy a couple every 6 months, or every year you can buy, so I agree with you. I think there's definitely probably should be some restrictions on that. I don't think making it harder to buy them necessarily helps. A lot of times, like you said, people who are doing harm are finding loopholes. Are not going through the legal system and buying them legally. They're finding, buying them on the black market, or sending somebody else to buy them for them. So
yeah, even I'm not even necessarily saying there should be a restriction on the number of guns people own. There are the collectors out there, and I've talked to a collector who had 200 guns in his basement, and he was a big, major hobbyist, and that's what he did. He collected guns. That's what he wanted to do, collect guns and have old guns, new guns, and he's not using them to go out and kill people. He's using them for sport, and he likes to have them and take them apart and put them together again, and do the stuff. Now, but if somebody, when collectors, they're going to buy guns at a bit of a time. So somebody, because they might want to think like, I want to get I really want to get a classic World War II rifle, or I really want to get, this type of gun, this type of new gun that's come out. But when somebody goes into a store and buys 10 of the same gun, 10 of the same model of AK-47s, exactly the same models, and that's obviously, why would a collector want just 10 of the same thing? So just don't know. So obviously there's certain things that should be like, okay, these are alarm bells. Why is somebody just buying 10 AK-47s? And really it was because they're buying them for a gun trafficking operation. to take to a cartel in Mexico, which is the cartel which carried out the massacre of 72 migrants, which is the cartel which put almost 500 bodies dissolved in acid, which is a cartel which killed an American agent, which is the cartel which on the border, and I talked to the Texas security officials about this. This same cartel was having a bunch of guys on the river, on the Rio Grande, with these guns, and the cartel also killed. They've killed various American citizens who come into Mexico, and the Texas I don't get the name of the institution, Public Safety Department, put gunboats on the river, and they told me they exchanged fire with some of these guys into Mexico. So and at the same time, these guys just walking into the United States, buying all these guns, taking them to Mexico, killing American citizens, killing American law enforcement people, exchanging fire with gunboats on the river, and the cartel is controlling human smuggling, and that cartel is controlling human smuggling and charging people, and this I think this is again it's ironic perhaps that a lot of people who enter the United States undocumented pay the cartel. They pay money to the cartel. I mean, the cartel is making money charging people to enter the United States. So you get a weird cross of issues there, where this issue of the right to bear arms and then any restriction or any hit back can also then clash with other things like the security of American citizens, the security of the border, and these other issues there as well.
Yeah, I remember, I don't know if you know who Mariana Van Zeller is. She's a Portuguese reporter and journalist. She did the documentary Oxycontin Express and a bunch of other stuff. But I remember on one of her documentary series, she was doing it on guns, and I forget where she was exactly in America, which city. But they basically, she bought an AK-47. They went into, I don't know if it was newspaper or something like that. They found an ad, made the purchase right in the parking lot of like a Walmart, and completely legal. Didn't need any ID or whatever. So after the shoot, after they recorded that scene for their special, they went to go have a couple drinks, and one of them forgot their ID, and they were like, "Oh, we can't serve you if you don't have your ID." And you're like, "I just bought a fucking AK-47 in a parking lot with no ID, but yet I can't have a cold one." So it's weird how these laws work, and you're right. I mean, I think that freedoms. I mean, I'm all for freedoms, and in many topics and subjects. I think sometimes I'm parallel thinking with a lot of libertarians, but I think that there should also be some restrictions. And have you looked into the Fast and Furious case? Because that was always a really interesting case that I never heard any more about. It seemed like I mean, the official story seemed pretty silly, like this idea that oops, did you look into that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something I'm looking into right now, continuing to investigate and look into this. And it is it's a big case. And so the thing about that case, so you had more than 2,000 firearms, which were trafficked into Mexico to cartels in Mexico, and which various people trafficking these guns were being watched by ATF agents. Now, I'm still investigating this, and I want to try and still understand some of the mechanics of this and what they were thinking. But the basic idea, from what I understand, is they wanted to try and build up a case and go after some of the top guys. Now, this is something interesting for you. Do you know that there is no law in the US of conspiracy to traffic firearms? That law doesn't exist. Meaning that, that the big thing on the drug cases, the drug war, is all about, they always use it all the time, conspiracy to traffic a controlled substance. That's the big thing. So they hit everyone with that. And you just do a conspiracy case, and you say okay, you're involved in a conspiracy to traffic a controlled substance. That law doesn't exist with guns.
Huh. So I wonder if that's because we traffic so many weapons. I mean, America, I mean, we've trafficked weapons. I mean, you look at a lot of the weapons that, in Syria, how much of that came from the U.S.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at, history of Afghanistan when, we're giving weapons to Bin Laden, to fight the Soviets. I mean, so I wonder how much of this is just to cover their ass,
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so like you look at the sheet of there's a whole bunch of firearms cases, and there's cases like firearms crimes include like selling firearms without a license. That's like one of the firearms crimes. Transporting a stolen weapon, with knowledge that it's a stolen weapon. That's another firearms crime. So there's a bunch of firearms crimes exist, and this is what the ATF uses. There is no crime that exists, conspiracy to traffic firearms. Now, probably the most notorious gun runner in modern times is Victor Bout, the Russian Victor Bout, which the Lord of War was kind of based loosely on this guy, trafficking guns, a lot of guns into Africa, Afghanistan, now president of the United States. Now, he was not prosecuted on gun trafficking. He was prosecuted on conspiracy to murder US citizens, giving material support for terrorist organizations, but not on the crime of gun trafficking, because that crime does not legally exist as a crime. So that was kind of one of the... But anyway, so the Fast and Furious, they were building case. I'm trying to understand really, talk to some of the people who are kind of now being, probably not working. A lot of the people who really did it, they're now being pushed out to retirement, and really try and find out what their thinking was. But it was to build some kind of case to go after the big guys, or was there something more to this?
Well, yeah, that was the official story. They said they were trying to they threw out the guns out there hoping that they could arrest them for them afterwards. But I think some of them actually got used to kill somebody,
yeah,
right?
Exactly, yeah. So, I mean, if you look at the way that drug trafficking conspiracy cases are built up, and this began, the DEA was created in 1973. And very quickly, the DEA started going and busting people. They're like, we can't do nickel and dime busts. I can't just go to the corner and bust the guy in the corner. I've got to go and get his dealer. So they start working up the chain and say, okay, we're going to go after hit the dealer who's his dealer. And I've talked to various drug dealers, drug traffickers, and tried to work out. Often you'll find 5 or 6 links, sometimes more, but 5 or 6 links in the chain between the kind of big suppliers and the person on the street selling it. So, they might sell it, somebody's selling it the ton level and the 100 kilo level, 10 kilo level, and going down to the guy on the street who's selling drugs. So they start building up these big cases, and this is what going after Chapo or El Chapo means. And you look at this crazy case and get into that case of going after El Chapo and conspiracy to traffic controlled substance. Heroin, crystal meth, marijuana, cocaine. Now, I think the ATF are trying to start thinking about the same things. We've got to try to build up, because what the Sinaloa cartel were doing and continue to do, what the Mexican cartels do, is they are involved in international arms trafficking, these people. Now, and I've talked to a pilot for the Sinaloa cartel, who's currently in prison in the United States, and described to me clearly when they're running planes, they're flying planes into the United States. They're also flying planes from Colombia to Mexico. They'll fly a plane from Colombia to Mexico with cocaine, and they'll fly back with guns. It's, movement. They can buy guns. They can buy, for example, 50 cal guns in the United States, $10,000. You might get a good Browning 50 cal. Buy that in the United States, take it to Mexico, use them in Mexico to fight security forces. But also, you've got a plane going down to Colombia. What should we take in it? Let's take some 50 cals down there. They like those down there. We can use these to help exchanging with the guerrillas for cocaine, or with any group down there. And they're using 50 cals down there. And these are groups that are designated terrorist organizations in Colombia, or designated terrorists by the United States. So they're building up this case. Now, obviously, it gets completely out of hand. And I'm not even sure if there's more to it than that, if there was other conspiratorial thinking there. Because like in the United States now, you have people who have conspiratorial thinking. This was about some kind of weird plot by the Obama government to attack the gun rights. In Mexico, people see this as like a conspiratorial plot by the United States to destabilize Mexico. because like, people in, average people in Mexico, they're hearing it's not what the United States government is trafficking 2,000 guns to the cartels who are carrying out this mayhem. So these guns keep on turning up in a bunch of crazy places. So you had the guns used in the murder of a border patrol agent in 2011, and then that triggers inquiries, which then triggers a whistleblower, which triggers a CBS report, and all this comes out in the light, and then the whole thing blows open. And then since then, you have had guns turning up everywhere. You had guns, you had a 50 cal turning up in El Chapo's last hideout, which in the city of Los Mochis in Sinaloa, and how big's the house where that was. You had guns turning up in Colombia from this same Fast and Furious, all the way down in Colombia. Wow. So that's how it shows the reach of what's happening. So now the thing about the Fast and Furious was that it was initially blown by, it was initially broken. The story was broken by CBS. And, obviously a big story. But then it was a story that's been covered by the conservative media, and a lot of the mainstream media has kind of stopped covering the story and become very politicized. And I think the mainstream media we should be covering this story. This is a story we should be covering. It's a story. It's not about left or right. It's a story about life and death. This is a very important story of a government mess up. But conservative media covering the story more because they see this as being Obama, Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General when this happened. So you have this kind of weird politics, or you have politics getting into the middle of this story.
Yeah, I think that becomes a problem too, because people will make every story about politics. It's like, I guess in some sense, maybe people being politically motivated sometimes pushes the story out more. I mean, you look at Benghazi, the left wanted to push it out more because of, they wanted to make Hillary look bad, or, the Fast and Furious case. Conservative reporters wanted to talk about it more just because they wanted to make Obama, I guess, look bad and Holder look bad. So, I guess your intentions might not be pure, but I guess if you're getting people to talk about the important topics and subjects, I guess there's probably some good that comes out of it, even if you aren't. Because how many documentaries and how many articles? I've read plenty of good articles on conservative websites, on liberal websites, on and I take it with a grain of salt that they have an agenda and they might be trying to push a opinion on me. But if they've done some good reporting, even if they only did that good reporting because they wanted to make somebody they didn't like look bad, I guess if the evidence is there and the facts are correct, then you can't completely discard it. So I
was critiquing more the fact that the mainstream media has covered it less. And but it's interesting. I think you segued nicely into a bigger idea about this issue of the media and and how now what is the media in right now in the 21st century, and how what we should do as journalists, and the ideological kind of questions. I personally will try and keep my mind very open and watch conservative media, mainstream liberal media, blogs, podcasts, and kind of go everywhere and try and be a kind of critical, independent thinker about this. Now, doesn't mean I don't have opinions and ideas, but just try and question my own ideas, my own prejudices. And yeah, sure, I think a lot of us in the media, in the mainstream media, we are in a bit of a bubble. A lot of us are in a bit of a bubble in terms of our opinions, being around people with the same values, the same ideas, and are disconnected from what a lot of other people do think. So yeah, I was just talking to somebody in the morning about the coverage of the migrant caravan, which I covered. Also, the migrant caravan coming through Mexico. I covered it at the southern border. I covered it in the middle. I covered it in the Tijuana, San Diego border, and coverage of that, and that was also very, very politically divided. And there's not easy answers to this. Like how in the media we need to help try and regain trust, or individually try and have trust with an audience, because a lot of people really do not trust the media. A lot of people do not trust the headlines. So we have to do a lot of work on an individual basis, on a collective basis, to try and regain some trust there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the emails I get the most from listeners now, or just people connecting with me, listeners connecting with me on Twitter or Facebook, wherever it may be, is that they like the fact that this show, looks at things from all perspectives. And I'm not trying to just send you an agenda, because I'll get people write me, messages saying that, oh, I used to like this podcast, or I used to like this website, but then they're leaning way too much left or leaning way too much right, or whatever it may be. And I think it's starting to get harder and harder to find people who, like you said, and I say this on the show all the time, like, I don't have conversations with people I agree with that I only agree with, because I don't grow with that. I want to hear other ideas. I want to hear my ideas challenged. I want to constantly reevaluate and recalibrate, like, where I stand and what I believe, and hear different perspectives. And anytime I'm wrong on something, I figured I'm just a little bit closer to being right, and a little bit closer to figuring something out. So I think too often people, like you said, they're just listening to people who they already agree with and agree with them, and you don't learn anything from that. You don't grow from any of that, and so I think that's a huge issue. I mean, like you said, even something like Fast and the Furious, people will just, I mean, somebody who could care less about that story if Bush was in office, cares about the story just because Obama was in office. So before we get off that topic real quick, I do remember reading that they said that there was no way of they said that they were going to track those guns, but there wasn't any obvious way on how they were going to track those guns. That was never.
Yeah. So I'm still to learn more about this case and really find out. Something I'm investigating right now. So you had this kind of people had this kind of rumors that they have something in the guns, like you got some kind of GPS in these firearms at least. So at least okay, that would be some kind of plan. You put a GPS in a 50 cal, and then you know where it ends up, and then you can use that information to show, okay, now we find out where these guys hide out. So, but I don't think that was the case. I think it was. There was certain work. They lost these guns. They lost where they were. They keep on turning up in embarrassing places. We don't know how many murders in Mexico they've been used in. I guess, again, getting back to the comparison with drugs, actually, they do this with drugs all the time. So you have the DEA going undercover, and they'll go undercover to infiltrate drug trafficking organizations. There's one guy I talked to who I did a profile of, who went down to Panama, and he pretended to be an independent transporter of drugs. So he says, he went down to the whole cover. He said when he was down there in Panama doing this was a few years ago, the movie Miami Vice came out. And in the movie Miami Vice, they're doing exactly the same thing. And he was like, fuck, this movie's the cinema. And if the guys could see it, and they could think, oh shit, they could realize what I'm doing. But anyway, he went down, said, okay, he said, I'm a drug trafficker, I'll move your cocaine for you. And I will, and then he moved a bunch of cocaine, tons, and then let it be bust. It's like, okay, I'm going to move your cocaine so I can bust it. But there are other cases where they're sitting there, they're watching these guys traffic drugs. They're watching guys and they're building up cases. The classic thing that happens, if they bust on the border somebody coming through with a bunch of heroin. So they'll find somebody with a bunch of heroin, a bunch of cocaine, and they'll bust them on the border. They'll have the customs guys. You have customs guys who are good at sniffing out who's moving drugs. And this DA guy used to be a customs guy, and he said, he would go up to these guys, get up in their face, go up really close, and he'd be like, oh yeah, what are you carrying? And read these guys. And he could tell, he grew up on the streets and could kind of tell who's involved. He grew up around gangs and stuff when he was younger, and kind of knew who might be involved in this. So he would find out somebody has got some, you could say, said, okay, you could say this person's carrying, search their car, and let's say they find a bunch of kilos of heroin or cocaine. What they'll do is say, okay, you've got a choice here. You can take it to where you want to take it. We can bust you right now, you can do 20 years. Or you can take it where you want to take it and walk away. And then we're going to bust them. Or we're going to follow this to take down the operation. Now, if that heroin gets out and somebody dies from an overdose, you're allowing that heroin to get out there.
Good point.
But it's not traced in the same way. You haven't got a serial number on a bag of heroin. So you can't trace that in the same way.
That's a really good point. I never even thought about it that way. It's like you said, because it's drugs and it's not a gun that you can actually trace to the death or murder or whatnot. It seems like, oh, no big deal. But I mean, it makes you wonder. I mean, this goes to another topic, not to get too conspiratorial, but it makes you wonder if they even want this to stop. I mean, I've had Freeway Rick Ross on, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and his story is. I was happy to get him on because I talked about his story all the time, and you're talking about a guy who, I mean, he became one of the biggest, drug dealers in the U.S. because he was getting the drugs from Nicaragua, but that was trafficked in by the government, and that's why he was getting it so damn cheap, and they, how many people? I mean, they basically, and you have Gary Webb who exposed a lot of this, and a lot of people turned their backs on him and made him look like a kook, and he's not a credible journalist or whatnot, but he connected a lot of these dots. And you had Barry Seal, who's flying him into Arkansas, which some people believe that Bill, in Meta, Arkansas was had some hand in maybe money laundering or and hiding some of this cocaine at this airport. So you had all these really interesting things, and it's like, to me it's like, if the dots are far from each other, then I can see like, okay, maybe I'm just being conspiratorial, but when there's that many dots, when there's that much smoke, there must be fire. And it's pretty, I mean, it's pretty obvious now that the U.S. definitely had some, and even Pablo Escobar, some people believe was working with the CIA or whatnot, or helping bring in some drugs. I mean, there's some people who have said that too. And then you look at just all the coups in Central and South America and Guatemala, and I mean, obviously the famous United Fruit Company. You look at in Nicaragua, the Iran Contras. We've had coups all over Central America, Panama, all these places, and we destabilize. We always talk about destabilizing the Middle East, but we never talk about how we destabilize Latin America. And I mean. Yeah, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, so absolutely, the issue of the CIA being involved with drug traffickers, I mean, absolutely true, and it's proven a lot of these things. Some of these things we should no longer call them conspiracy theories. These are now things we should have on the historical record. I mean, Gary Webb's Dark Alliance series, and one of the interesting things, actually, I thought about this, is that when he released that in the early 1990s, and it was a big story. It was kind of early internet, and totally, massive. Really got out there. But a lot of people rejected it, and back in those days, people found this idea of saying you're linking the CIA to drug traffickers a kind of controversial thing, a difficult thing to get out there. I think nowadays it's not even controversial. Nowadays, we're in an era where people don't trust their institutions in the same way as they did back then. So now we're, how far are we from that? Like 20 years, 20, 25 years on from that. And now people everyone's already believe the CIA involved with drug traffickers. At the same time, we have to get into some of the nuts and bolts of this and what really happened and what really these relationships are. A lot of the time, and Gary Webb was indeed himself misquoted to attack him. So he would be saying people would be going, this guy Gary Webb's crazy. He's saying the CIA is on the corner selling crack. And it's like, no, I'm not saying the CIA is on the corner selling crack. I'm saying the CIA worked with drug traffickers. So definitely. But yeah, I mean, you can keep on following these lines out there. There's still things to be uncovered, and this goes, it does go right back from the 70s or from the 60s. There's a whole bunch of things that if you look at the drug trade in Latin America, you can look at things in the 60s, in the 70s, and with the CIA going, all the way over to Southeast Asia, and the French Connection and all these different things. But absolutely, look at the issues with Honduras, with Nicaragua, with all of these places and involvement with drug traffickers. And again, this gets back to what we were talking about before of what is the attitude, or how should the United States look at the issue of the violence in Latin America, which I think is a big issue of global concern to the United States for the reasons that you said. These are the countries you're sharing a hemisphere with. And if you have refugees arriving at the southern border saying, I want to come and claim refugee status because I was attacked and I've got a bullet in my leg, or I was shot by a gang member working with a corrupt policeman, and arriving at the southern border saying this. But it's like the United States doesn't have a single cohesive policy on this. It has different policies. So you have the drug policy, but then you have the CIA's policy. And the CIA's policy is a completely different agenda than what the DEA has. So, the CIA suddenly has the issue of we've got an asset, a political asset there. And our priority is to have that asset who's useful against the communist government we're against. Or that asset is useful, against the communist government, one time, and then against an Islamic radical government another time. I mean, the Northern Alliance. I mean, these guys involved in trafficking heroin. Before I'm sure you know this already, before the Taliban had a ban on opium in 2000, 2001. Now, I'm not saying, these bans are a good thing, but it's an example of when you have a super authoritarian government and they're like, if anyone grows any opium, we're going to cut their head off. They reduced opium massively. As soon as they were knocked out, they were knocked out, the Northern Alliance, loads of those guys involved in opium, heroin, and then the Taliban that recuperates goes, well, fuck this, we're going to get back in the opium and heroin trade as well and supply our insurgency. So you get what are the interests there? So absolutely, that's definitely a very legitimate story to cover and keep covering.
Yeah, I forget what percentage of heroin comes from Afghanistan now, but since the U.S. military's been in that country, it's gotten up quite a bit. And I think it was even a reporter on Fox News was reporting in Afghanistan. They actually had the U.S. military basically protecting these farms and stuff. And I mean, it's the thing about government. It's you have the left who blames everything on corporations and whatnot, and then you have the right who blames everything on government. And it's no, they're just corrupt people everywhere. And wherever there's money and power, there's always going to be corrupt people. And I don't think it's either or. I don't think that because you put on a suit and tie and you're you were voted in as a governor or mayor or whatever it may be, it doesn't make you any more moral of a person or any less likely to do something corrupt than a guy in a drug cartel. Because the thing is, and I think I've heard past interviews with you talk about this, and I think Rick Ross also said this about how he got into drugs because it was his last resort. He had no other options. And I mean, how many of the people have you met? I mean, I'm sure it's probably some that are completely just fucking crazy right from birth, and then other ones that are okay, I have no other options. This was a last resort. I didn't want to do this. I didn't want this lifestyle. I mean, did you see both?
Yes, this is a lot of the work I've been doing over the last 18 years is documenting, getting testimonies of people involved in the drug trade, involved in drug cartels, involved in gangs, and I always look at their want to map out their life story. So look at not just interview who are they now, but look at how they became this person. go right back to their childhood and kind of look at what was their life path that led them to be this person, which in many cases can be people doing very evil things. I mean, decapitating people while they're still alive, torturing, murdering, all this kind of crazy stuff, kidnapping. So there's different stories, there's varieties of stories. Often there's a case, and true of Mexico, Jamaica, Central America, Brazil, there's often a case of people who grow up in very poor circumstances, often dysfunctional families, or separated without a father in very poor areas, and recruited into the organized crime, into I call them gangster warlords, recruited with these drug cartels. They have different names around Latin America. In Mexico, it's drug cartels. In Central America, it's street gangs. In Brazil, they call them commandos. In Jamaica, they call them posses. But a lot of these things are very similar, really. But they're recruited when they're young. Often, they start hanging around with these groups when they're 12 years old. They can start being, like they're originally initially on the outskirts. And the thing is, so you look at some of these neighbors. Look at Ciudad Juarez, and you have these poor neighborhoods, and the government isn't offering very much to these people, if anything. What's the government really offering? Military goes in there now and again, pulls some people down, takes some kids away, tortures and murders them. The street's not paved. The electricity's not working half the time. The water's not working half the time. You have to travel some way to a school, but maybe you have to go through neighborhoods controlled by different street gangs, and you can't even get to the school. So these kids aren't really seeing much prospects from what the government or from the wider corporations are offering them. And then the drug cartels go in there, and they'll go to these. They'll see these kids and go, okay, you want to work with us? Look at me. I've got a nice truck. I've got money. I've got gold here. I've got 5 girlfriends. Okay, all you got to do is I'm going to give you a cell phone, and you're going to stand on the corner, and you're going to report whatever vehicles come past, or whoever comes past. If it's like me coming past a regular, some weird white guy in his neighborhood, okay, phone up, tell us. If it's police, if it's military. And I've actually also I've been with police listening into the frequencies of these spies talking and how they talk about stuff. But anyway, so they offer this to these kids and say, okay, I'm going to give you a cell phone. I'm going to give you $100 a week. Oh, wow. I'm going to have $100 a week. I could have, my mum, I'm living with my mum. My mum's broke and's got no money hardly for food. I'm going to be $100 a week and a cell phone. Sure, I'm going to work with these guys. And then once you're in, that's it. You're in. It's not you can just walk away. I'll see you later. You start beginning. It's like, okay, now you're doing that. Okay, you're doing that. You're sending messages. Now you're going to move up and you're going to start moving stuff around. You're going to, I'm going to say, take this package to this place. Do this. I'm going to give you a gun. Okay, yeah, give me a gun. Okay, then you start. Then you're in it, and then so they grow up as a teenager with this stuff, and some of them, they see this. I mean, it's just the world they're in. It's, you're living in, it's a whole different, world they're seeing. They're in this place. This is the power. And then they're inside. They haven't got the option to walk away. If they walk away, they could kill their family. So it's like then they're inside. And then they tell them, you've got to go and murder that person. It's like you can say no. Oh, yeah, no, I don't want to do that. I was down in Honduras with a guy, and I was working with a guy in Honduras, a driver, and worked with him the first time, worked with him over the years, worked with him one time, and it was then, and he said, like, my son is starting to hang around with this gang, the Barrios Beats, started to hang around with the gang. And he goes, I'm going to let him find his own path. The next time I went down, it was like the gang had ordered him to kill somebody. He refused, and then they'd like trying to kill him. And then I was with the guy. Said, "Oh, can we go and pick up my son? He's just been staying. He's like terrified. He's been staying indoors the whole time. Doesn't want to go on the street. They're going to kill him." I was like, "Well, they're going to kill him. It means I said, I said, don't worry about it. Bring him along, bring him along. And he was like in the car with us, kind of like a geeky 17-year-old kid, wanted to play computer games and stuff. But he was like in the car and stuff, hiding down and stuff. So like we were going out of town. So yeah, take him with us. So yeah, sure. I mean, it's about these organizations. They're machines. These are machines. And then it's like, how do you figure out these levels of homicide? Where it's not like people getting angry. It's not like suddenly some guy says something to me and I'm like, fuck you, and get angry. It's like about machines of murder. These are like organizations, like quasi-military organizations. So how do you try and break these down? How do you try and change that? And that's one of the big challenges.
Yeah, one thing you brought up, which I think is really interesting, and it's something I brought up a few times in the past. I mean, I've had a Nick Bryan who wrote the book The Franklin Scandal on, and Matthew Valentes, he did the movie Open Secret about the Hollywood pedophilia parties and problem with with that stuff. And I brought this up to both of them, and they both kind of didn't really see things from my perspective. But I think when you look at the history of the people who become the criminals, at one point they were the victim, and they were the victim of violence or trauma, and then eventually they become the same criminal or the same I guess tortured soul that's doing violence and causing trauma to other people like it was caused to them. And you see that with pedophilia. You see that with and it's hard to ever sympathize with somebody who's doing some really terrible things. But we have to sometimes I have to remind myself, like, okay, you look at their history, you come to find out that, like, okay, this person was traumatized. This person never had a chance. Like, this person was, is mentally unstable because of what happened to them. And so, yeah, I think in a lot of cases when you do a little bit of background, research, you realize, like, holy shit, like, this person, they could have been a normal person like you and I. They could have been just a part of, civilized society, but they never had a fair chance because some really bad shit happened to them.
No, absolutely, yeah. The victims and victimizers, and that's a big thing. When you look at the gang ritual, it almost ritualizes that victim and victimizers. The gang ritual, a lot of these street gangs, the Barrios Beats, the MS-13, is they get jumped in. You know what I mean by being jumped in, where they'll be like, for the MS-13, it'll be the count of 13, they'll be beaten by the rest of the gang. I think with the 18th Street, it's the count of 18. So that whole thing almost like ritualizes this victim and victimizer. You're going to be victimized, and you're going to, you're going to be a victim, and you're going to victimize other people. And you do that. A weird thing where they say, like, when they talk about that, where they have the rest of, like, the gang beating the crap out of them. And I even heard gang members tell me it's like an act of love. It's like, it's some twisted shit. And then there's like that culture of, that when the MS-13, when they're doing, I mean, some of the level of antisocial crimes they carry out in Central America is pretty crazy. I mean, these are real stories. I mean, things like...
How much has this stuff affected you? We're talking about trauma. I mean, have you gotten any trauma from any of this?
I mean, to an extent. I think to an extent. I think perhaps though that sometimes in the discussion now about PTSD, people are starting to overuse the term a bit. And I even heard a funny thing about saying that some of the people who are like paid by like Facebook and like to like look at the videos to try and see what they should censor. They look at like bad violent videos, are getting like PTSD from seeing those videos. And it's like, really, are we kind of overly playing that all of us are so sensitive that we can't go out and do our jobs? And I think there's a job that we should go out and do. I think, we should go out and cover gang violence. We should go out and cover cartel violence. We should talk to people who are mass murderers. We should go out to scenes of shootings, to refugee camps. We should do this stuff. But yeah, I mean, at the same time, yeah, without a doubt, it's like it's I think you do need to be aware of it as well, that you don't become completely desensitized. And I think one of the issues is to being desensitized to this, and your reactions are getting too badly desensitized to this. I've seen way more dead bodies than I can count. Now, what does that mean when you're seeing an act of violence? Are you becoming just cold to seeing acts of violence? When am I too desensitized to like, well, you see these very intense situations, and then, you become desensitized to people suffering, to people suffering from these things. Now, I can kind of swing different ways because, like, I can sometimes feel I'm just becoming cold, and then I can suddenly see something which makes me like tear up. Like, I was down in Honduras, and there was, I could suddenly like be in, I remember going to a prison in Honduras a few years ago where there was the worst prison fire anywhere in the world, like 360 dead, and I was in cells where everyone burned alive. And I remember I left that scene of that and went to the capital and just drunk literally like half a bottle of rum. And then looking back, I mean, it's like, why did I just drink half a bottle of rum? It was like, okay, this stuff's heavy. You're seeing. But then I was also in Honduras, and there was a girl, and she'd been injured from a stray bullet. And the bullet it was a gang shooting. The guy went to try and shoot her brother when she was 12 years old. Tried to shoot her brother. She was like playing. She was messing around, 12-year-old girl. And a bullet hit her, went in to her waist and went through her spine. And she lost the use of her legs. I talked to her when she was 14, 2 years later. And she was a pretty girl, a nice girl, and who was crippled, and he was like living in a poor neighborhood in Honduras. It's hard enough anyway, living there as a cripple. And I was like, and what really got me, I was talking to her and I said to her, so you going to school? And she was like, no, I'm not going to school because they haven't got in the school any facilities for wheel. There's no ramps or anything. I can't go to school in a wheelchair. And I was like, what do you do? So I just lie down and watch TV. And that, it was suddenly that detail, that little detail. It was like this thought of this girl, 14 years old, crippled, and the potential of, I was just saying, just lie down and watch TV. And it was just that, I was just like, I was just like, suddenly like, had to control myself. And was like, we left them, we went to around the other house where we were like hanging out with these people, and a woman made us some food, and I was like crying. It's that little. So suddenly you get like a weird thing where you can be like really insensitive about stuff, and suddenly kind of feel that kind of suffering there. But yeah, sure, it's stuff to deal with, but I don't want to overplay it either, because it's like, I mean, this is stuff we should be going and doing. A lot of the world is like that. I mean, I think. A lot of the world, this pain and suffering exists in many places.
Yeah, and I think we need people like yourself to highlight it and talk about it. I mean, you talked about how bad some of the places in Central America are. I mean, I know a lot of my tobacco from my cigars come from Honduras and Dominican and Nicaragua, and I don't think these places are bad because all these premium cigars are coming from there. How can they be bad places? And so I think, do you think some of this information has been, because actually my wife and I were supposed to go to Mexico for the first time this year for the honeymoon we never had, because she was pregnant with our son when we got married, so we never went on a honeymoon. And then we had some friends that wanted to go down there, and we thought about going, and people are like, oh, are you fucking crazy? It's so dangerous. And I'm like, oh, is it? This and that. And I mean, but then I'm like, well, the tourism spots have to be, I guess, important to the economy of Mexico. So do you think how dangerous it is? Do you think some of the information is actually suppressed for, tourism, to not hurt tourism? Is the country much worse than what we're told, because they need to keep those Americans coming, or those foreigners coming to spend money?
I don't think Mexico has tried that hard to suppress it, and they obviously haven't been successful, because everyone you ask them, they know about the violence in Mexico.
Yeah, that's true.
I remember I was in Costa Rica. They were like more sensitive. There was some story about drugs being smuggled to their national parks. It was a true story, and they got really angry about it because they thought it would threaten their tourist industry in Costa Rica. They're like, but Mexico. The thing about Mexico, people still go, and you can still go. I mean, if you want to go to a resort in the Riviera Maya, if you want to go to a resort, in Cancun, in Los Cabos, you can still go to these places. And you should still, I would encourage people to still go there, to the resorts. And I still go to the resorts in Mexico and enjoy. I still go to Acapulco. Mexico City, I jump on a bus. It's a 5-hour bus ride. You can get a hotel for a pretty cheap price, and you're on the Pacific, on a lovely beach on the Pacific with lovely waves and great food. And I'll still go down there to the hotels down there. At the same time, there are certainly places in Mexico with real dangers. I think there's a bit of understanding. I mean, when people, there was one woman who wrote to me one time, said, my 16-year-old daughter wants to go and stay in Tamaulipas state. And I just said to her, to be honest, that's dangerous. I wouldn't allow my 16-year-old daughter to go and stay in Tamaulipas state. But yeah, go to a Cancun, go to a tourist resort, absolutely.
Yeah, that's it is, because when we first started talking about Mexico, we talked about how bad it is, and how really nobody's really talking about it. But people have to remember that just because one part of the country or certain parts of the country are dangerous, it doesn't mean there aren't places that are safe to travel to and go to. I know Jesse Ventura, he has a place down in Mexico. He spends most of the year down there. So, I mean, there's, it's definitely a beautiful culture. It's beautiful. I mean, the food's amazing. The music. I mean, there's definitely things to love about it. I love experiencing different cultures. So it's it is I guess one of those things where you want to get these stories out. You want people to realize that there's issues in these countries, but you don't want to scare the shit out of them so they don't go visit these countries and enjoy some of the beautiful things about them.
Yeah, I mean, and also, first there's that. I mean, there's certainly some places you can go to safely. People have different thresholds of risk as well, and even some of the high risk places. I mean, it depends. If I go to them as a journalist, and I've got to touch wood here, but like, I still enjoy going to a lot of these places. I still like. A lot of the high risk places are still beautiful places. There's still places where I enjoy going to, where they have great people and great food and great scenery as well. So it depends, even then what your threshold is. But certainly, I like the idea that the work I'm doing, when I do like a story about the violence, that I'm, trying to tell people to disengage with Mexico. I think it needs, more engagement or less. But there are real risks and real violence, and it is a real issue. So yeah, it's kind of juggling those things, and how much there's that sensitivity. There's certainly effort sometimes by people in the Mexican government to say, to try and say, oh, you're giving Mexico a bad name, or somebody in a tourist office somewhere. But they haven't been very successful in that. So, I think there's been a lot of coverage. Maybe you say from your perspective, it seems that people aren't talking about it that much. From my perspective, it seems there's been a lot of coverage on Mexican drug violence. I mean more so than some stories around the world. I think there's been enough coverage on this, and there should be, and then we'll keep covering this stuff.
Yeah, well, which is very important. I mean, you look at it, it's funny because you talked about how like that one little girl's story hit home, and I think that's the problem with some of these stories is when you hear statistics of like hundreds or multiple people dying it doesn't hit home quite as much. I mean, you look at on Netflix recently, they released that special on Madeleine McCann, the British girl that went missing in Portugal, in Algarve, which is another, supposedly very safe place. I mean, I grew up in Portugal. I've never known Portugal as being a dangerous place, but this shit can happen anywhere. And it's putting light on human trafficking, which I'm glad, because I think it's much bigger of an issue than people probably tend to believe. And but yeah, I mean, I think I think there is these conversations need to be had. People need to not just focus on this one cute little white girl. It's really easy to just get people get obsessed with this story about the one really cute white girl, and then when you hear, I remember in Mexico, I don't know if I think they did find the bodies when they found 20 school kids that went missing, and eventually they found the bodies in a ditch or something like that.
I think maybe the case of the 43 students.
Oh, that's what it was. Case? Yes, the students.
Yeah, so that case was 43 students were abducted by police
because they were protesting, right, or something. They were.
Yeah. It was basically they were. Part of a group which would go and take buses. There's a kind of practice by some of these students where it's a rowdy practice, but they'll go to a bus and say, well, we're gonna take this bus and use this bus to take us to a protest. And they were doing this, and a series of events happened. Police turned up. There was some shooting. Then the police just detained, but abducted them, and they didn't really arrest these guys. They just abducted a bunch of them, tied them up and put them in trucks, and they just disappeared. And there was this one. The official theory is that that the police were working with a drug cartel, who took them, burned them all on a bonfire, and burned them all. But then there's doubts about that, and even if that's true, and if something else happened, and who else was involved. But yeah, absolutely crazy place. But what you said before about this stuff, I mean, it is tough. I think again, as many challenges as journalists, but one of the things we have to do is try and bring these stories to people. So try and bring. Now, one of the things that I think is good about the issue of drugs and crime, this is something which people can relate to. Because people have issues of drugs and crime wherever they are in any country. You have drugs, you have crime, you have guns. These are issues that affect people. So, when I try to bring these stories, it's like trying to bring, this is not just happening in a foreign country, just trying to imagine it like you're there. Try and you're the eyes and ears of the reader. Try and bring this home. Imagine this is you there. This is in your country. This is happening. It's not a foreign story necessarily. This is an issue of people that could be, in a neighborhood. One of the reasons, one of the tragic stories, but a story I do tell a lot. One of the ones that's touched me most was a mother whose son was abducted by an armed group in the city of Monterrey. And she was a school teacher, and the kid abducted was an 18-year-old philosophy student. But the fact he's a philosophy student, some people who might be themselves students could relate to the fact a philosophy student is abducted and murdered rather than just some poor kid in the ghetto. They can relate to these facts because, in Mexico you have people who are studying philosophy, you have people who are computer scientists, you have people who are educated professionals who this stuff is happening to as well. So it's like how do we, and I think that's part of our challenge that we have to do as journalists is bring these stories home to people. And, one of the ways I look at for telling stories, I've always liked telling stories, I guess. And I have friends back home who are great storytellers, who are not journalists, but just, guys who are great storytellers in a pub with a pint of beer, or people sitting around, whatever, smoking weed or hash or whatever, or just sitting in a park hanging around, or people who bunk off school, as we say in England, and cut classes, just telling stories. And the way that people can just tell stories, I think the technique of telling stories is a big part of it. That's what we have to do How do you engage people? How do you grab their attention? How do you say, like make people interested about this stuff? That's again, what we have to do is to try and make people interested or encourage people to be interested. And that's part of the challenges. It's difficult in this world because we have information overload and things coming out. What I don't do so much is, because there's so much information and it becomes a white noise, that sometimes the very sensationalist headlines are the ones that people respond to from either side. So that's why I think in a lot of, both from the left and the right, quite sensationalist angles will often be out there that are very emotional. And that will, and I try to do that. I try to actually just tell stories that people can relate to and can look at.
Yeah, it's like that quote: "One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic," or something like that. I think it was. Quoting.
I think Joseph Stalin.
I think it was Stalin who said that. Yeah, which not the guy I want to be quoting, but it was.
It's a great. Absolutely.
Yeah, it is, because I think it does make a good point. The fact that when you hear, okay, the U.S. accidentally bombed a hospital in whatever country and all these people died, it's like, oh, whatever. But then when Nancy Grace is on TV talking about this missing, boy or girl on, this one person, people get so obsessed with the story. I mean, you look at the Anthony Casey or what Casey Anthony what story. I remember my wife was obsessed with keeping up with every single detail, and I'm like, this is happening everywhere, right? I mean, this type of stuff happens all the time. I mean, and there's, and it's unfortunate because then you have other families, and I think even in that Netflix documentary about the Madeline, the disappearance of Madeline, like, some of the Portuguese families that had missing children, they're like, we're not getting these resources, we're not getting all this media attention, so it is one of those things where when you can make it personal, when you can kind of relate to, like, I could see, like, this could be my little girl, this could be, I think it makes it easier for people to connect to the story and get involved.
I had one story years ago for the Houston Chronicle, and the editor said, "Oh, why don't you go to there's a town in." He saw the temperature. There's a town in Mexico called Mexicali. Mexicali, which is on the border with Calexico. Like Mexicali means Mexican California. Calexico is California, Mexico. Kind of. But anyway, the Mexicali, we saw it was like the temperature was like crazy temperature. It's like one of the hottest towns in the world. It's hit like insane. It's like hotter than Death Valley in this town. People live there, hotter than Death Valley. It's like, yeah, I'll go there and write a story about this town being hot. And I was like, is that going to be that interesting? A town's hot. Is that, what's the headline? It's hot. But anyway, so I went to the town, and he was actually smart. He saw a story. I think it's a very Houston story, because I went there and I started off doing a profile of a guy who, loads of people there had no air conditioning. They can't afford air conditioning. And in the summer, it'd be so hot, he would take his children and his wife, and he would leave his house and go and camp in the hills because it's just too hot to sleep. It's just fucking crazy. And I wrote this story. I remember somebody emailed me, and I wrote the story leading with this guy, and she was like so touched by the story of this guy. She was like, I would like to buy the guy air conditioning. Somebody used to, I cannot believe somebody lived without air conditioning. I was like, well, I don't know what happened. I was like, well, you could maybe look to a charity might better. The problem is, if you go buy the guy air conditioning, you don't have the money to pay the electricity bill to run the air conditioning. Because even that's like how people, the level of actual resources people have is like very different than you might imagine. But it's funny how people can suddenly relate to that. Like quite a simple story, they can relate to the human. So we can relate to other humans, and we do have, I guess that's part of what we have. And these are keys you look for as journalists, and one of them is empathy. You've got to look for empathy in the readers and wherever they can relate to these things. The other is that people are sociable. And one of the things that, we have to, as journalists, always look for is people are sociable. You start being sociable with somebody and get them to talk, and they start talking. And that's, what I do when I'm convincing gang members or, cartel members or, people saying, or anybody. It's like, I want you to tell me about your story. Tell me about it. Yeah, and how do you convince somebody to start being sociable? People, they are sociable. A lot of people want to tell their story. They want to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, you hear that over and over again from people, investigative journalists and reporters, how initially, it might be hard to get them to talk, but once you get them to open up, they almost seem like they're happy to tell the story, that they're getting something maybe off their chest, or they feel relieved to finally be able to talk about it out loud. So I'm sure in many cases, yeah, that's probably that. A lot of times they're probably telling you stuff that they haven't told anybody or very few people know. And I think maybe once you get them talking, maybe they actually feel better, getting this off their chest.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's different things. I mean, I had a great, you have people, sometimes they say, like, I haven't told this to people before. They haven't actually sat down and talked about, like some of these guys might go through their life and they've never sat down and talked to somebody about, they tell incidents about when they carried out their first murder. And they haven't ever sat down and said this before. They've never sat down and said and describe. And I'm like, okay, so you carried out a murder. And how did you feel about that? Did you feel guilty about that? Did you dream about that? How did you feel inside about what you did? And they haven't talked about this stuff before. In some cases. So yeah, it's interesting. You've got to kind of be this, a listener. But yeah, it's at its best, it can still be a beautiful profession, I think, journalism. And yeah, we've got a battle of how we can try and tell stories in better ways, persuade people to trust us. But it's something that it can be a great thing to do, and it still needs to be done.
And so your newest book is El Narco, right?
So, okay, let me give a shout to some of my books if I can.
Yeah, please. Yeah, absolutely.
So, so the books have, like always, these books have several different covers, and I haven't got the. So this was the. This is actually my first book called El Narco. Inside Mexico's criminal insurgency. That was my first book. I probably recommend that. That's the first book I wrote. I probably still recommend if someone's to jump in to read that first, because it's probably a bit more accessible and it kind of built, a lot of the story, the bigger story of Mexico. And then my second book, which I'm also very proud of, and is called Gangster Warlords. And this first book is just about Mexico, and this second book has a section on. It's on 4 distinct gangs in Latin America and the Caribbean. One in Mexico, one in Brazil, one in Jamaica, and in Honduras. Whereas this is just about Mexico and about the drug war. But yeah, absolutely. Anybody reading is most appreciated.
And they're available obviously anywhere you can get books, Amazon. And
yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So like they're on Amazon or all the other different Barnes and Noble's website or different websites. They're in Kindle. They're in audio books, not read by me, but read by an actor who's got a much better accent and a more precise way of speaking than me, or read by actors. And they're in bookstores, or order them from bookstores. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. I could listen to you for hours. You probably have, obviously probably years of stories that you could tell and experiences. But I love hearing people who have experienced so much and just your take on being not, I'm just kind of a spectator when I read these stories and I research the stuff. When you actually meet the people and you get the perspective from somebody who's actually having one-on-one conversations and interactions and going to these countries, it's nice to get that perspective, because you never know what, how bad things really are, what, and to put faces and names and to these families and people that are being affected. I think it reminds us how important it is to keep talking about this stuff and hopefully find some solutions.
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess that's one of the things that you know drives doing this stuff. You think, well, I have to be doing this to try and look for solutions. That this violence doesn't happen. And I mean, you could, we can hope. That as I guess as human beings. And this is what somebody said to me. I remember I was in Jamaica, in this area where there'd been all this violence for so many years. I was just saying to this guy, is there really hope here? And this guy said, "There's always hope." I remember write it down with big uppercase letters in my notepad. There's always hope, and I guess there's always hope about this. And I guess human beings have we've done incredible things, found solutions to so many problems. So for sure that we can find solutions to these problems as well, and then find more problems to worry about.
It's true. Well, thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your Friday, and hopefully we talk again in the near future.
Absolutely. Take care. All the best.
Take care.